Hi there. Thanks very much for joining us today. So we have a panel and we're exploring the question around how to reimagine our relationships with audiences and communities that reflect this new world that we're living in and which is evolving around us. And from a cultural sector perspective, and I've got 4 panelists with us today, and I'd like them to introduce themselves one by one. I'm going to start with Claire Antrobus.
Hi, so I'm an independent consultant, coach, facilitator, working on organisational culture. I began my career as a curator and art historian, working with contemporary and modern art galleries, and I moved on to work in funding roles and in leadership roles in galleries and museums. But I think most pertinent to these conversations is the work I've done over many, many years, helping organisations become more audience focused in terms of their strategy and their organisational culture, to be more attentive to, informed by the needs of their audiences.
Great, thanks Claire. And can I come to Rob next?
Hi everyone, I'm Rob Macpherson. I run a small brand consultancy for arts and education clients at the moment. It's called Impact. I've been running for just a year, and I've been doing a lot of work on communications, advocacy, practical advice, launches, and advice for board and trustees, that kind of thing, senior teams. Before this, I was, for about 15 years, I was Director of Marketing and Development at Birmingham Hippodrome, which, although it's a charity, it isn't subsidised. So it balances what we used to call a commercial head with a charitable heart, pushing all those huge West End musicals through on a very strong money-making basis, but only to fund the stuff around contemporary work, education, community, and festivals, working with lots of NPOs. From the RSC to international touring companies, you name it. So always been involved in marketing, PR, fundraising, and brand. And that's really where I'm focusing my energies now.
Thanks, Rob. And Becca.
Hi everyone, I'm Becca, Pelly-Fry. These days I'm mostly an independent curator of contemporary art, also doing some bits and pieces of consultancy like this. For the past 7-8 years, I was director and head curator of the contemporary art space in West London, which was first known as Griffin Gallery and then became Elephant West. Before that, I was working in local authority as an arts development officer, running kind of borough-wide arts programs, funding programs, festivals, things like that. Before that, I was in Durham. I was director of Durham Book Festival and involved in the beginning of Durham Lumiere, before it became what it is now. And so across all of that, which is a bit of a mishmash, it's all been about working with people really, and engaging people with a wide spectrum of different types of art forms, and thinking about how you do that on a number of different levels. How do you reach people? How do you engage people? Particularly those people who think this isn't for me. That's always been a big part of what I do, is saying, yeah, it is. It's definitely for you, it's for everyone. You just have to find ways of opening the door and holding people's hands as they come through, really. So that's what I'm all about.
Beautiful, thanks Becca. And finally, David.
Hello everyone, I'm David Micklem, and I'm a writer and theatre producer. I'm the co-founder of an organisation called 64 Million Artists, and I guess that's particularly pertinent today because I want to talk a little bit about cultural democracy, which is something that 64 Million Artists has been campaigning for the last 3 or 4 years. I'm also the former joint artistic director at Battersea Arts Centre in southwest London, which is an incredible organisation committed to helping support what's happening next in theatre. And before that, I was at the Arts Council England for 6 years, where I was the senior theatre officer. So I took a responsibility for a particular strand of theatre strategy. It's great to be here today.
Thank you so much. So I feel like those experiences and perspectives bring a really rich combination of insights to this conversation. So we're thinking about reimagining relationships with audiences and communities that reflect the new world that we live in. So when we're thinking about how cultural organisations might respond to that reimagining challenge, what kinds of what kinds of strategies or insights might they want to evolve and develop? I'm going to perhaps run through asking each of you in the same order that question about what are you interested in, what do you bring to this question, what are you interested in suggesting cultural organisations might want to explore if they're to reimagine relationships with audiences and communities? Claire.
Thank you. So I think the things that come to mind immediately for me are things I've been thinking about for about 10 years, actually. I went back to some research that I did as part of a research team for Mission Models and Money when we were looking at resilient organisations 10 years ago, what enabled them to be resilient. And it struck me looking back at that a lot of the things, the critical success factors that were helping organisations back then innovate and thrive are still pertinent today. So those were strong understanding of community audience need and that really driving strategy, a clear organisational brand and culture, transparent and accountable artistic leadership, and a commitment to understanding organisational impact, and things like flexible staff structures, which are covered in other strands of this work. So I think what's really critical now, and the questions I am really interested in exploring are, first of all, when we talk about reimagining relationships, relationships with whom is the first question that comes to mind. And I mean, incredibly aware that our organisations are not as relevant as we might like them to be a lot of the time. Many organisations are far from representative of our wider communities. There's been some really interesting calls to action over this weekend from Joe Verrett, for example, in terms of really reimagining who, when we know all arts organisations are not going to continue to survive, the responsibility we have to be more representative if we are going to continue to seek public subsidy. And there are some important questions about who we're going to prioritise in our communities. Secondly, I think critical to success is understanding our community and audience needs. And I'm really interested in how those needs are shifting and what people might want differently from arts organisations given the with COVID and post-COVID situation, and then all the economic, social, political changes that are going to happen as a consequence of this pandemic, which are going to be massive when you start looking at what this will mean longer term for our society. What will we want from arts and culture now as opposed to before COVID? And I think there's some really interesting work we could do looking with civil society at how those organisations are beginning to ask some of those questions and respond to them. I think transparency is going to be critical in terms of the difficult conversations we're going to need with all parts of our communities, including on questions about what we do, what we're going to have to stop doing, who we're going to need to prioritise with our staff and our workforces as well as with our audiences, and also around resources and how we're going to resource our organisations. There's often been a connection in our business models between our audiences and our resources, and COVID is disrupting that. We need to have some difficult conversations about resources. I think transparency is going to be critical, as we're seeing at the moment with the return to school that's happening today. If we're not transparent as leaders in terms of what the situation is, what our decisions are, how we are operating, we will lose trust and we won't be able to achieve the change we need to achieve unless we're clear and open in how we're dealing. I think that's one of the key kind of principles of cultural democracy, is that we're transparent in how we work and accountable. And finally, I think there's something really interesting in a period of massive change around what Stephen Covey calls starting with the end in mind, that looking to our impact and trying to understand our impact and trying to have the best impact we can. I think I'd love to see more creative and simple and quick and dirty ways of really testing and reviewing how we're doing things, so that we'll be testing new ways of working all the time, and we need information to feed back and adapt how we're working.
Great, thank you so much, Claire. Really interesting. Rob, where would you, from your sort of professional perspective, where would you take this conversation around reimagining relationships with audiences and communities?
Well, of all the strands that People Make It Work are doing across this, I think this is possibly the most blue sky. which is both exciting and challenging, because I think that sort of unknown is quite paralyzing for some people. So I think that there's also a tendency, I think, for people, and you're seeing quite a lot of criticism on arts social media networks at the moment about some people are less inclined to look for big change and perhaps more inclined to think about sustaining where they are and just desperately hoping that it can go back to normal as they knew it. So there is I don't know if you know Clay Shirky, who is often regarded as sort of godfather of the internet, and the Shirky principle is, I've got it on the wall here: institutions will try to preserve the problems to which they are the solutions. And it's a real, sobering thought that, you really can't do that. You've got to keep pushing ahead and changing. So it's easy to say, let's use this as an opportunity to really revisit all we believe in. But there really has never been a better time. And I think now that the first sort of 2 or 3 months, we've all come through that shock. It's absolutely essential that people spend some time thinking more blue sky, thinking about the why, followed by the how and the what, and not getting those things in the wrong order. So I think that one of the things I'd like to be able to offer through this is a few practical tools. Claire was talking about, start at the end, the sort of vision of what you're trying to get to, and work back from that. There's some great practical tools that I've run in some workshops that really open people's minds and give them a degree of confidence, I think, as well. And I think that's very important, because I think that ideas now can come from anywhere. I've said this before on some of these People Make It Work sessions, and I do believe it, that the craziest idea coming from the shop floor, so to speak, or from someone who you might regard otherwise as being a fairly detached trustee, might come with something completely left field. So it can come from anywhere. It doesn't come from top down necessarily. So a new sense of hierarchy, I think, is something that we should be open to and really willing to explore. I think that the days of technophobia are gone, and there's absolutely no excuse now not to be sort of up on the digital stuff. Nobody would imagine that they could get very far without being on top of the basics of finance or customer service or some production skills, and seemingly the same across everyone's responsibility now. And this is a brilliant opportunity to learn across the age ranges, because younger people are more familiar, and in your organization you'll have interns and younger people who'll be able to explain it to older people. This is a great way of reimagining those links, I think, and restructuring your teams to take the best of what people can offer across their skills. And I think that my particular area of brand also reflects this. When we did a massive brand dive, all the brand dives that I've done, most particularly the Hippodrome about 5 years ago, it was such an eye-opener to us that it was virtually the only circumstance in which you would get that conversation between a 20-hour-a-week casual and a trustee who'd been on the board forever, and actually communicating about something in an open, sometimes robust conversation. That's what it means to you, but it doesn't mean to me. And people being prepared to talk about those things makes for a really, really vibrant conversation. So there's a great opportunity to do that. Lots of great structures that we can do. It also does away with that hippo effect, highest paid person's opinion, which can really get in the way of people coming forward with new ideas. There's a lovely piece. Lee Thompson and Matthew Syed have written brilliantly on this. And I saw a quote recently from Matthew Syed saying, you have to separate the quality of the idea from the status of the person suggesting it. And there's been a lot of criticism. I'm sure others on the call here have seen that criticism about brainstorming being really stifling, because people are showing off, or people are unconfident, or people don't know what they'll think. But just twisting that into brain writing and anonymized suggestions is a fantastic opportunity. And I've been using Jamboard recently, where you can just submit ideas, written ideas that you can work up individually or in small groups before you share them more widely. And this is a brilliant use of both technology and flattening of hierarchies to come up with brand new ideas. So it'd be really, really interesting to explore how that would work. Much more like a kind of digital open space where people can really, really feel more confident about that stuff. But it is, as we've said, this is about reimagining, and that's one of the toughest domains. So excited to get involved in it.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rob. Brilliant. Becca, where does this conversation take you when we're thinking about reimagining relationships with audiences and communities?
Well, I think I'm probably just going to kind of segue on from what Rob's just said. And I think the reimagining space, as you said, can feel like quite an enormous mountain, particularly if you've got kind of day-to-day issues. And we are, let's remember, in the middle of a global crisis as well. We may have stabilized somewhat, but that is still ongoing, and we're heading into ever unknown territory, really. I mean, all of the information that's coming out around us is at best educated guesses. And I think that's the same for any leader. Anyone in their daily lives is making educated guesses every second of every day. So we are in that landscape. Given all of that, and I think we should really try and keep that front of mind as much as possible, that every single person is under an enormous amount of personal and professional stress and strain. That cultivating presence is really important. That's quite a difficult thing when there's a lot of things to juggle. But in order to reimagine, you need to be really, really present, and allowing for things to come to you as much as going out. It's like, it's got to be a two-way situation. And I think, again, following on from Rob said about flattening hierarchies and allowing for all voices to come through, also allowing all of those people to feel safe and secure. Safety and security, I think, is really critical for us to be imaginative. We almost kind of need to be bored to be at our most imaginative, and this is the least boring scenario ever, apart from being locked in your house. I think as much, I think a kind of leader position at the moment, the responsibility is in creating a safe space for people. That's what I'm feeling at the moment, is that for people to feel comfortable and safe. Feeling comfortable and safe, you can be imaginative, you can be free, you can feel safe to say what's on your mind and bring ideas into the party as well. And I think in terms, you can then reflect that towards your audience or your community as well. I think if our communities are feeling safe, they will also be much more willing to engage with art and culture, I think. Imagine if you're uncomfortable and cold and hungry, the last thing on your mind is going to be art and culture. You'll want food and safety and shelter. So art and culture, as we all know, is really vital to our well-being and our sense of being human. So I think it's our responsibility as cultural leaders to create the space for that to happen, which, again, going back to what Claire was saying, that's about really responding to need as well, and thinking about the role of culture now, today, tomorrow, next week, the week after. I think that will shift as we go along. So being able to cultivate presence really, I think, is about looking. So looking around you all the time, being really aware through your eyes, listening. So kind of what I'm talking about is using all your senses, really. Listening to what others are doing, listening to what others are saying, without the need to respond necessarily, absorbing, and allowing yourself time to process what's coming in through your senses as well, so that you can then productively have a response, and allowing room for that to happen. So for yourself, but also with others. Time is something that we seem like we have an endless amount of, and also never enough of. So getting that balance is right. I think all of this process for me has been about rebalancing, getting balance right. Not too much of one thing, not too much of another, and it is a tricky tightrope walk. But I think that sense of presence will allow you to bring all of that forward. So yeah, for me, big thing is cultivating presence in yourself and in your teams and your communities too.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Becca. And finally, David.
Great. I run the risk of saying some of the same things that my esteemed colleagues have already said, but I'm going to say them in just slightly different words, just to sort of really put some of those thoughts front and center. I suppose when you ask that question, Richard, my response is to think about a kind of bottom up and a top down response at the same time. So sort of two separate frames of thinking about how we work more creatively with our audiences and in our localities. So I wanted to start off thinking about the people that we're there to serve. And I think that in the arts and cultural sector, for too long, we have treated our audiences as consumers or subjects. We tell them things and we sell them things. And there are some notable organisations that don't think like that, but too many of our arts and cultural institutions, despite all the great work that they've done, tell us things and sell us things. And we live in a world where we want to be active citizens. We want to be active in everything. We make content, we share content. We want to be actively engaged in decisions that are being made, not just about arts and culture, but about everything. And yet too many of our arts and cultural institutions, I think, still don't treat us like active citizens. So I guess this is a call for ways in which we can think of the people who have a stake in our organisation, the people who live and work locally, feel engaged as active citizens in what it is that we're doing. So I guess that then leads me to say, well, then what role does leadership have in supporting that active citizenship? And again, I'm at risk of repeating much what Becca said here, but I think that good leadership, when we're thinking about cultural democracy, is as much about listening and asking questions as it is about Rob's hippo having all the ideas. So I think that one of the things I would suggest that arts and cultural institutions who are not just surviving but thriving do is ask a series of very well framed questions to their stakeholders time and time again to really build up a picture of what their needs might be. And I think one of the challenges for leadership is that that means relinquishing power. So often many of us, myself included, have spent 20, 30 years of our career climbing that greasy pole to get to run, in my case, Battersea Arts Centre. And the last thing we want to do is then give away the power. We're the hippos. We've got, we're the highest paid executives, and it's our gig and it's our organisation to run. And so I guess part of the challenge for leadership in this arena is to think about new ways of actually relinquishing that power to the people that we exist to serve. Sometimes people say, but if you relinquish power to the people, you get bad answers. If you ask people to name a boat, you'll get Boaty McBoatface. I would argue that in that context, the wrong question was asked. It was an oversimplified question that was asked on the internet and got picked up as a meme and a joke, and we end up with Boaty McBoatface. I think if leaders can ask brilliant and incisive questions again and again, and through asking those questions, show that they're listening and really build up a picture of the people that live and work in their communities, I think you can get organizations that will not just survive COVID-19, but thrive through it. And that civic role that's at the heart of all of our missions will be better amplified through the fact that, I'm sorry, I'm mixing metaphors, but the thumbprints of all of our audiences, all of our local people, will be all over the things that we do. So I think, yeah, if we're trying to look at a kind of radical reinvention of our relationship with audiences, I think it needs to start with leaders giving up some power and listening much more actively to those people that are dynamic and more diverse citizens within our local community.
Thank you, David. Wonderful. So this is a very fast digest of what some of the questions are that we might want to ask. But we heard during this panel, we heard people talking about thinking about the needs of the communities that we serve, about the need for transparency, and starting with the end in mind. We thought about the kind of the ways in which, as institutions, as Clay Shirky says and Rob quotes, institutions will continue to sort of maintain the problem that they've got the solution to. Can't do that at this time. How do we create a new sense of hierarchy? How do we avoid the hippo? How do we embrace new technologies in order to be authentic and explore what our brands can bring? How do we cultivate presence? How do we create a sense of security and safety in order to engage others, in order to explore and develop creative cultural experience together? How do we find a way to balance the bottom up and the top down? How do we play a role of leadership that isn't about telling and selling culture, but is about listening and asking, relinquishing power, and ensuring that our audiences, our community's thumbprints are all across the work that we're making? So this particular panel is the beginning of a strand of work at People Make It Work. And over the coming weeks, you'll find on our website at peoplemakeitwork.com a set of tools and conversations for you to have and be guided through with your colleagues, your audiences, the communities that you're connected with. And it's one of 5 strands of work that we're exploring right now, bringing expert panels like these together, supporting them to create tools and structures and conversations that we can all get involved in order to move our thinking forward and craft the organisations that we need for the future. And those 5 are an investigation into what does a new business plan look like, fit for our times, how do we work differently within our teams, our organisations and across partnerships, how do we reimagine our relationships with audiences and communities, which is the topic that we've been exploring today. How do we generate new income and new value at times when ticket income, secondary spend and other sources of income are under so much pressure? And finally, how do we deliver or present or imagine our work being experienced at this time in this with COVID or post-COVID context? On People Make It Work, you'll find those panel discussions around each of those topics, and as those topics go live, tools emerge for you to access. And Change Creation, our program with 60 leaders from 40 organisations, gets an in-depth month-long exposure to these questions and to working with our wonderful panellists to help bring that work to life. For now, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. And if you're watching this video, keep an eye on this strand on our website, and you'll soon see tools and resources coming through that you might want to use in order to progress your thinking on ideas. Thank you very much indeed.